Wow, 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 ladies and gentlemen. I seen a lot today that we have to discuss. I seen a lot of issues and good things when it comes to the grand arrivals between Tszyu and Errol the True Spence Jr. But before we discuss the pros and cons of how both fighters are looking, speaking, holding themselves during these interviews, I thought out of everything that I've seen at the grand arrivals today, you know, I'm a man who's looking for confidence. I'm a man who's looking for something in Errol Spence Jr. to make me believe that this is 100% full-fledged Errol Spence Jr. gonna try his hardest, Errol Spence Jr., and tried his hardest and trained his ass off in training camp. I'm gonna hope that that's the Errol Spence Jr. that we get. So I need confidence. And out of everything that I've seen at the grand arrivals today, I want to show you guys a clip, ladies and gentlemen, of Ronnie Shields explaining how Errol Spence Jr. came into his hands, what he looked like, and how important it was compared to a fighter who has been retired for years, a fighter who was inactive, a fighter that was messing around gaining weight. The Errol Spence Jr. that got handed to him, ladies and gentlemen, it's exactly what I want to hear from Ronnie Shields. It makes me think, wow, with this fight being at 160 pounds and Errol Spence Jr. not having the cut to 158 to 154, absolutely deplete himself. And if not deplete himself, have to focus more time into the weight cut rather than focusing more time into the game plan. Ronnie Shields confirmed something to me that I believe is going to play an important factor going in to this Saturday night. Listen to this, and then let's discuss who won the grand arrivals, who looked better and who looked worse, ladies and gentlemen. Check this out.
The first thing I asked him was, I said, have you been training? He said, I never stopped. I said, oh, cool, that's you know. And then when he came down and I saw him, I said, man, you look like you're in good shape already. He said, I tell you, I never stopped training. He said, you know, I wasn't training like serious for a fight or nothing, but, you know, every day I was doing something and I kept my running up and stuff like that. So he said, man, I told him, I said, most guys that be out 3 years be like 100 pounds overweight. I said, man, you look like you're on weight already. He said, I'm not far. So, and I said, okay. I said, let me put you through some hard workouts first. I said, then we could talk afterwards and, you know, I'll let you know what I think. He said, okay, no problem. And I did, man, and I pushed him really hard the first day. I'm talking about really hard. And he said, what you think? I said, so far, so good. So after the first week, we sat down and I told him, I said, man, one thing I'm glad about, you never stop working. I said, because you don't have to start from the beginning. Now you at a point to where I could just put a plan together and we just, you know, put a great game plan together and you just work from there. And that's what we've been doing. We had some really good sparring partners that came in and some that I really thought was going to really, you know, I didn't know how strong it was going to be, but, you know, and he got in there and he handled his business, you know, and even they were coming to me like, wow, after 3 years, he's like this? I said, yeah, man. I said, he never stopped working. I said, and that's the difference between him and somebody that retired and just did nothing for 3 years and decided to come back.
Ronnie Shields explaining. And like the fact that that's how Errol Spence Jr. came into his training camp, due to the fact that now all Ronnie Shields had to do was not focus on trying to get Errol Spence Jr. back to where he was, as in a retired fighter who you basically needed to start from the beginning again, or a fighter in Errol Spence Jr. who gains 100 pounds, who's slow, lazy. Ronnie Shields was able to focus mostly this training camp onto the game plan instead of the weight cut, which is so important against a guy like Tszyu, because you've got a game plan against a guy like Tszyu who leaves many, many openings. Bruh, I watched this dude Tszyu fight, and I say, dude, Errol Spence Jr. should be able to knock him out. But the question is, what type of Errol Spence Jr. are we getting? Wow. Let's get into that. Ladies and gentlemen, I see Errol Spence Jr. make his entrance to the Grand Rivals, do his interview standing right next to Sean Porter, Paulo Malignaggi. And I say to myself, wow, this dude looks fantastic. Errol Spence Jr. looks there, bro. He looks aware. Don't get me wrong. There's a couple times where he looks a little tired sometimes. His eyes is a little, suspect. But Errol Spence Jr. has always looked like that. The slur, everything. It's always in the back of your head. But he always looks like that. I see him walking around. I see him taking pictures. I see the smile on his face. I don't see an absolutely depleted man trying to cut weight. Errol Spence Jr. is looking good. I see somebody that doesn't look nervous. He talks about not having to fight in Texas, that the dude would have had to do 50 interviews, news in the morning, broadcast, everything. But in this fight, with Tszyu being in Australia, it's a lot more calmer. The pressure isn't on him. He says, and Ronnie Shields says. And I thought that stood out to me because as I seen Tszyu enter the Grand Arrival, I don't know if I'm the only one out there that's thinking this. Let me know in the comments if y'all agree. But Tszyu got that nervous energy in him, ladies and gentlemen. I see him next to Sean Porter and Paulo Malignaggi talking about how this fight is different than all the other fights. That he fought it in that fight against Jeff Horn, and he fought it in that fight against Tony Harrison. But in this fight with Errol Spence Jr., I see Tszyu standing there, and I see super nervous energy. Bruh, sometimes, for some fighters, it's actually better not to be fighting in your hometown in the biggest, most important fight of your career. Because sometimes you got so much things to do with, so many people texting you for tickets, you got so much on the plate, so much people, so much pressure on you, that it ends up being too much rather than you being able to stay focused. If Tszyu would have came to the US, not as many people would have been bothering him. Not as many people asking him stuff. A lot more focused. Bro, I see nervousness from Tszyu. That's what I see, bro. We're going to have to see tomorrow at the media press conference. But that's what I see. And I see a leaked video be released with Errol Spence Jr. doing a little face-off with Tszyu. And the man says, I still ain't shaking his hand. And I ain't shaking his hand after the fight. Ladies and gentlemen, he brings up the comments of Tszyu saying that he's going to knock the eyesight out of Errol Spence Jr.'s life. And Errol Spence Jr. says, nah, bruh. This dude thinks he wants to be shaking hands with me and this and that. Hey, Ronnie Shields trained this man. And Ronnie Shields says that this isn't the same type of Errol Spence Jr. that you're going to get in the past. But this is a better one. That's what Ronnie Shields say. Ladies and gentlemen, now, of course, that's what the trainer is going to say. Is the truth we have yet to see. This training camp has been a lot different than Errol Spence Jr.'s previous training camps well, first of all, super different than his last training camp against Terrence Butler Crawford, because the dude actually got sparring in. Ronnie Shields said he got some great sparring partners. He thought that they were going to do some good work on Errol Spence Jr., but it turned out not. That Errol Spence Jr. was handling his business. Okay. Another thing that's different about this training camp is Errol Spence Jr. says he's usually grinding 6 or 7 days. Back in the days when he was young. But this one, with Ronnie Shields, they focused a lot more on recovery. Because he's getting older, his body can't do the same things. His body needs more time to recover, to stay healthy, to stay 100%. There's been times where Ronnie Shields will have him train Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, take Thursday off. Friday, Saturday, take another day off. A lot more recovery time. And I remember Floyd Money Mayweather Jr. was the man that brought this up. I don't know, man, maybe what, 10, 15 years ago? He taught me a lesson. And he was one of the first guys that I seen this with, when he was talking about, as you get older, a lot of people think that you got to train harder. You got to work harder. Because you think, oh, I'm getting older, man. I got to, try to be as fast and as strong as I was when I was younger. So how am I going to do that? I got to work harder. But no, you actually got to calm down a little bit. Ladies and gentlemen, the body doesn't work the same anymore. It's about keeping the brain healthy, in the body and the mind. As you hit 36 years old, going on to 37, in these stages of your career. So all that being said, the only con that I would say I see from Errol Spence Jr. during these grand arrivals was the fact that, I see him and Ronnie Shields still talk about retirement. Errol Spence Jr. talks about, when he beginning of training camp, he was dreading it. But as he got more into it, 2 weeks in a row, 3 weeks in a row, he's back in it. But he said that it was grueling. Ronnie Shields says, even if Errol Spence Jr. wins, he could possibly retire. Just due to the fact of how grueling training camp is and all this time you got to prepare and put into this, being away from the family. Errol Spence Jr., ladies and gentlemen, is still contemplating retirement. And if the result of this Saturday is going to absolutely matter, ladies and gentlemen. Let me know what you guys think. I thought Errol Spence Jr. won the grand arrivals today. I'm absolutely excited. As you can see, I could go on all day about this. But I think it's time to call it right there, man. Tszyu looking nervous. Errol Spence Jr. looking fantastic. Don't get me wrong. Sometimes he's got those sleepy eyes. I think to myself, is there something there? I don't believe so, ladies and gentlemen. I see a lot of holes in Tszyu's game. I think this is an opportunity for him, for Errol to take advantage of that. If he can't beat a guy like Tszyu, if everything that Ronnie Shields has been saying doesn't end up applying in the ring on Saturday night, then I guess that's it, ladies and gentlemen. And we forever will know that. Let me know what you guys think, though. Absolutely breaking news.